If your father had a workshop, there was a blue vise bolted to his bench, 35 pounds of cast iron, jaws that closed square, a screw that turned smooth after 40 years of sawdust and neglect. It was a record, made in Sheffield, painted in a shade of blue, classified as roundel blue, the same as the inner ring of the RAF roundel. For 70 years, 1,000 workers on a 17-acre site turned molten iron into the tools that furnished every British school workshop and every serious shed in the Commonwealth. Then the brand was sold to an American conglomerate that closed the Sheffield factory within 6 years and moved production to China. The replacement carries the same name, the same model number, and a slightly different blue, the field mark collectors used to tell the original from the copy. Today, the Parkway Works stands derelict on Kettlebridge Road, awaiting demolition for warehousing. This is the story of Charles Hampton, a black country iron founder who came to Sheffield in 1898, copied an expired patent so well he built the standard tool of the British workshop, and how everything his family made was unmade by a series of owners who never once walked the factory floor. Not through one disaster, through a long succession of reasonable decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. Chapter 1. Black Country Brothers in a Steel City. The story begins with a falling out between two brothers, and a word that would outlast both of them. Charles Hampton and his brother Joseph were sons of the Black Country. Their family ran the Steel Nut and Joseph Hampton Limited at the Woden Works on Franchise Street in Wednesbury, Staffordshire, a firm founded in 1851 that made nuts, bolts, set screws, lifting jacks and vices, trading under a name borrowed from the Anglo-Saxon god of war, whose memory the town itself preserved. It was a comfortable inheritance, the kind of thing a sensible man holds on to. In 1898, the Hampton brothers walked away from it. They crossed county lines into Sheffield, the global capital of edge tools, cutlery and crucible steel, a city where the Cutlers' Company of Hallamshire had governed the blade trade since 1624, and where firms like William Marples and Sons, Spear and Jackson, Joseph Rogers and George Wostenholme were among the most respected industrial names in the English-speaking world. Beneath these established houses ran the Little Mesters system, hundreds of self-employed master craftsmen who rented power and bench space inside larger works, producing finished blades and tools by piecework. Geoffrey Tweedale, in his 1995 study Steel City, called this dense network a self-reinforcing system. Every firm fed every other. Sheffield didn't need two more Black Country iron founders. Sheffield had everything it needed already. The partnership of C and J Hampton did not survive the year. According to family memory preserved by Tony Hampton in conversation with the American writer Scott Landis, recorded in the Workbench book, the brothers fell out almost immediately. Joseph returned to Wednesbury to rejoin Woden. He never came back. The J in C&J remained in the company name for more than 70 years, an absent founder commemorated on every catalogue cover, a ghost initial that nobody ever thought to remove. Charles carried on alone, joined around 1900 by his two sons, Horace and Charles W. Hampton. Their first products were unglamorous, marlin spikes and specialist castings, the workaday hardware of a port and rope economy. The firm became a private limited company on 14th May 1908, by which time it had taken premises at the Eagle Foundry on Livingston Road. There was no Quaker piety here, no Cadbury-style philanthropy. The Hamptons weren't Sheffield steel aristocrats with generations of local standing. They were outsiders who'd crossed the border into a saturated market and needed something to distinguish themselves. What they found was a single word. On June 10th, 1909, trademark journal entry 313, 863-4655S, Charles Hampton registered the name Record. The application listed the firm as engineers, iron founders, and general tool manufacturers. The telegraphic address was Vices, Sheffield. No primary source explains why they chose that particular word. By the time anyone thought to ask, the name had become so naturalised that asking seemed absurd, like asking why Sheffield meant steel. Chapter 2. The Vice that copied a copy. The first true record product, the one that fixed the brand in British workshops for the next century, was the Model 23 Vice, given a full-page spread in the firm's earliest surviving catalogue of June 1910. It was, as research by the Tools and Trades History Society confirms, an almost exact copy of the Parkinson design of the time, the quick-release fitter's vise, patented by Joseph Parkinson in the 1870s, whose patent had now expired. Woden tried to sue. Tony Hampton told the story bluntly. The vices were unprotected by patent, and the lawsuit failed. The brothers who'd left their father's firm were now openly copying its competitors' expired designs, and they were willing to improve what they copied. A series of patents followed that would define the record vise for the rest of the century. Registered Design 664709, filed in July 1918, replaced cast-iron sliders with steel rods, a cleaner, stronger mechanism. Patent GB 292381 of August 1927 added a screw and nut cover that shielded the moving parts from sawdust, producing the A suffix vices, the designation that would appear on the most iconic of all record products, the 52.5A. Patent GB 409804 of November 1932 added a sawdust excluder plate and a removable half-nut housing with promotional stickers that read like a small manifesto. The record vise has two important features. 1. Sawdust, excluder plate to prevent clogging of moving parts. 2. Nut easily removed for cleaning. Keep working parts lubricated. By the mid-1930s, the numbered range was set. The number 52, number 52.5, and number 53 woodworkers' vices, the number 23 fitters' quick release, the number 34 engineers, the number 75 garage vice, and would change in detail but not in essential character for half a century. Each one was an incremental improvement on the one before. Each one was protected, and each one was painted in a specific, faintly luminous mid-blue, formerly classified as BS 381C110 Roundel Blue, the same shade as the inner ring of the RAF Roundel, supplied by R.J. Stokes and Company Limited of Sheffield. The colour would become the visual signature of British craftsmanship for the next 70 years. Then came the planes. In January 1931, catalogue number 10 announced 8 adjustable bench planes numbered 02 through 08, mirroring Stanley's American numbering precisely, plus 3 block planes. They were copies of expired patent Stanley Bailey designs, marketed as an entirely new British product. The timing was strategic. The late 1920s tariff regime and the Depression-era Buy British campaign gave domestic makers cover, and Stanley's American patents had just lapsed. Patent 362743 of December 10, 1931, introduced the Stay Set two-piece cap iron, identifiable by the SS cast into the lever cap, a design that would remain in production until December 1947. But the acquisition that truly shaped the brand came on October 10, 1934, when C&J Hampton secured the manufacturing rights to Edward Preston and Sons' entire range of iron planes and spokeshaves from John Rabone and Sons. Rabone had bought Preston in October 1932, but found, in their own polite formulation, that certain products were found not to conform readily with the company's other interests. With the Preston pickup came the shoulder rebates, the bullnose rebates, and a plumb bob and mitre box line. Sheffield was now making everything Birmingham had made. The transfer was complete. That same year, Record published Planecraft, a how-to manual written in-house by C.W. and W.E.N. Hampton, later expanded with the American educator E.W. Schramm. Re-impressed in 1943, 1945, 1950, 1953, 1954 and 1959, it became the British woodworker's Bible, the hand tool Mrs. Beaton. A generation of grammar school CDT teachers learned their craft from its pages. The number 4 smoother, the number 5 jack, and the number 7 jointer plane would be made continuously from 1931 for over 70 years, among the longest production runs in British metalworking history. Charles Hampton had come to Sheffield as an outsider with a suitcase of marlin spikes. Within 35 years, his sons had built a firm that could teach Britain how to use a plane. Chapter 3. Wars and the men named on certificates. Charles Hampton died in 1929. His sons Horace and Charles W. became joint managing directors and took the company public on Horace's death in 1948. The Second World War, which fell between these family transitions, left marks on the products themselves. From 1939 to 1945, plain lever caps and small screws ceased to be nickel-plated. Wartime metals control diverted the material, and instead carried a war finish stamp on the lateral lever, a wartime austerity badge that collectors now prize as a dating marker. The number 405 multiplanes survives in surplus condition with what the trade calls wartime grey finish. 11 carpenter's braces introduced in 1939 were listed as temporarily out of production in 1944 due to pressures of the war effort. They never returned. A whole tier of specialty planes, the number 02 smooth, the number 077 and 1366 bullnose rebates, the 015, 016, 017 and 019 block planes, the 0101, vanished from the catalogue in 1943 and never came back. The war ate the margins of the range, and the core survived. Bernard Road and Ouse Road sat squarely in the German bomber footprint during the Sheffield Blitz of 12th to 15th December 1940, in which over 570 civilians were killed and 78,000 homes damaged or destroyed. The Hampton Works survived. Some of their neighbours did not. Behind every catalogue lay a small dynasty of named workers whose presence connected the early foundry years to the post-war golden age. Charles Atkinson had been foreman pattern maker from around 1890 to 1930, a Little Mester role spanning the Eagle Foundry and the Ouse Road eras. His son, Hedley Atkinson, joined in 1924 as an export clerk, rose to export manager, and finally general sales manager, and served 50 years until 1974. His daughter, Jan Rhodes, preserved his papers, letters and notes from sales trips he made on Record's behalf to Scandinavia and South America in the 1960s and 1970s, and posted them on the Sheffield History Forum in January 2009. Among her treasures was a long service certificate dated 6th May 1974, in recognition of 50 years' service, signed by A.B. Hampton, chairman, on Record Ridgeway Tools, limited letterhead. That signature belonged to the last great patriarch. Charles W. Hampton had chaired the company until around 1958, when his son, Mark Anthony, Tony Hampton, succeeded him. Tony Hampton was the founder's grandson and the company's final family steward, a member of the Cutlers Company of Hallamshire, later a director of Tinsley Rolling Mills, which supplied the rolled steel sections for record cramps, and, according to the Sheffield electrician who wired the new warehouse lights in 1966, a managing director who walked the factory floor every day. I remember Mr. Hampton coming round his workforce every day, the electrician wrote, posting on the Sheffield History Forum under the handle Old Rider, to check everything was satisfactory, a managing director who knew his shop floor by name. It's the kind of thing people only think to write down after it's gone. Chapter 4. The Cathedral on Kettlebridge Road. In 1963, the year Beeching cut the railway map and Sheffield broke ground on the Park Hill Flats, C&J Hampton consolidated its operations at the Parkway Works on Kettlebridge Road, Sheffield S 93BL, in the Darnall Industrial Belt, about 4 kilometres east of the city centre, off the new Sheffield Parkway. It wasn't a relocation so much as a coronation. The new catalogue number 17 was issued the same year. A new face casting and a slightly lighter shade of roundel blue marked the vices. A square boss handle replaced the round. Sheet metal slide retainers replaced the older cast brackets. New suffix codes ordered the range: P for plain screw, C for cramp and combined, E for quick release, D for adjustable dog. The 52.5 ED, 9-inch jaws, 13-inch opening, 35 pounds of malleable cast iron, was now what every British school workshop and every serious British shed bolted to its bench. Already in 1962, Record had taken a 50% interest, jointly with William Ridgway, in William Marples and Sons of Hibernia Works, the most prolific Sheffield woodworking toolmaker, employer of around 400 people, owner of the Shamrock trademark and the blue chip chisel. By 1961, a Dun and Bradstreet listing recorded C&J Hampton with 1,000 employees, manufacturer of hand tools, bench vices, pipe tools and bolt clippers. The small foundry that had started with marlin spikes was now the beating heart of Sheffield's hand tool trade. The Parkway Works, as the post-1963 generation, knew it was a multi-tenanted, single and two-story industrial complex of red brick buildings with steel frame additions and multiple loading door access. Eventually, about 17 acres of site. The main building carried signage that read Record Tools/C&J Hampton Limited/Sheffield, confirmed by Jan Rhodes from her father's 1960s exhibition photographs. A cast-iron promotional bulldog, the firm's secondary motif, standing in for British tenacity, was distributed to dealers. One resurfaced on eBay in 2024. Inside, the workflow had a logic that read like a kind of materials geography of Sheffield itself. The iron foundry poured malleable iron for the premium engineer's vices. The numbers 34, 84 and 84/34 with their integral hardened anvils, and grey cast iron for the fitters and quick-release types, green sand moulds and the resin and burning smell of cores, ladles tipping into floor moulds, the slow grey radiance of cooling castings. Tinsley Rolling Mills next door supplied the rolled steel sections for cramps. Plain irons came from local Sheffield laminated steel rollers with hard tool steel cutting edges forge welded to softer iron backs, a technique that had defined Sheffield blade making since the 18th century. The pattern shop was Charles Atkinson's old domain. His ghost lingered in the wooden templates that shaped every casting. The heavy machine shop turned single-start Acme thread vice screws on capstan lathes, ground plane soles flat to within thousandths of an inch. Record's commercial selling point, the flatness that separated a tool from a toy, and machined diamond pattern serrations into engineer's vice jaws. The rasp of capstan lathes, the high singing of surface grinders. The hardening shop case hardened the front jaw plates and the screws, then oil quenched them, leaving a dark blue oxide patina that collectors today use as a forensic marker of authenticity. If the patina is right, the steel was hardened in Sheffield. Then the paint shop. Stoves enamelled the bodies in Stokes's Roundel blue, a warm chemical tang of stoving enamel that anyone who's worked near a powder coating line would recognise in an instant. Final assembly, lubrication, factory test clamping, and the red and white Record cardboard packaging followed. The hardening plant was specialised enough that Old Ryder, by then a contractor, was sent back some years later to service special-purpose machines for hardening steel. The machines were still running. The Sheffield they served was still producing, and underneath it all the constant percussive rhythm of drop hammers from the surrounding Don Valley plants. Tinsley Rolling Mills next door, William Cook's steel castings, the dozen edge tool firms along Bernard Street and South Street. The entire Sheffield steel quarter compressed into 1 square mile of soot, vibration and purpose. A man arriving for his morning shift at Parkway didn't walk through a factory gate. He walked into a city that made things. Chapter 5. A British Answer to Stanley. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Record range had reached a breadth and reputation that no other British tool firm matched. Commercial Motor magazine, on March 6, 1970, ran a full product feature listing 11 types of vise in 50-plus catalogue numbers, with prices ranging from the small number 3 mechanics at £1.19 to a number 632 6-inch combination vise at £45 7 and a heavy chipping vise at £83 3. The number 75 garage vise received its own loving description. 5 1/4 inch jaws, a 7-inch opening, a pipe jaw capacity of 2.5 inches, overall diameter, 51 pounds of British cast iron with a swivel base, offset jaws, a hardened steel anvil, pipe grips, a removable hardened steel front jaw and a pipe and rod bender. £16 6 on bench mount. The plane range ran to dozens of catalogue numbers. The bench planes 03 through 08. The block planes 60.5 and 09.5. The circular plane 020, the plough planes 044C, 045C and 050C, the number 405 multiplane, the duplex rebate 778, the Preston-derived shoulder and bullnose rebates, the A15 one-spoke shaves, the T5 technical jack with its 2 1/4 inch cutter, the small model makers' planes. To these were added T-bar sash cramps, G-cramps in the same iconic blue, Stilson wrenches, pipe cutters, hand drills, bolt clippers, the Holdfast 146, the Dowling jig 148, and, still in production from 1898, Marlin spikes. A single company in a single Sheffield works, making virtually everything a British workshop could need. Record's true competitor wasn't another British firm. It was Stanley Tools of New Britain, Connecticut, the American company whose expired patents had given Record its start. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the consensus in British woodworking circles shifted decisively. Record had pulled ahead on quality, thicker castings, flatter soles, better finished irons. David Lynch, the Australian collector whose recordhandplanes.com is the closest thing to an official chronicle of the firm, put it simply, Record never compromised on quality, and it wasn't long before they were accepted by the woodworkers of that time. Paul Sellers, who would later become the most influential British hand tool teacher of the 21st century, recalled the Record number 52.5 vise as the standard British school workshop fitting of his youth. Marple's blue-chip chisels were the curriculum tool. Record planes were the curriculum plane. Between them, they furnished every CDT room in the country. Hedley Atkinson's export network carried the blue tools across the Commonwealth. Record Tools Incorporated at 1915 Clements Road, Pickering, Ontario, served as the principal North American node. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa absorbed Sheffield's output in quantities that still show in the second-hand market. Record-stamped vices turn up in Antipodean attics in disproportionate numbers, a small material diaspora following the old trade routes. On September 29, 1972, C&J Hampton merged with William Ridgway & Sons, the Sheffield wood-boring specialist founded in 1878 at Rockingham Street and later the Oscar Works on Edward Street, to form Record Ridgway Tools Limited. The Times of January 3, 1973, reported the formation. A group of 14 UK companies and 5 overseas companies. Record contributed planes, vices, clamps, and brand. Ridgway brought the wood-boring catalogue, augers, bits, and motorising tools, and the jointly owned 50% of Marple's, which was now folded in. The merged group covered virtually the entire British woodworking hand tool spectrum. On 25 February 1976, it acquired Platt's Forgings of Willenhall to make dies for the rest of the group. The 1974 Hedley Atkinson Long Service Ceremony, with Tony Hampton personally signing 50-year certificates on Record Ridgway letterhead, marks the high cultural moment of the firm. A managing director who still walked his factory floor every day. A sales manager retiring after half a century. A brand whose blue paint was found in every workshop from Stoke Newington to Sydney. For a few years in the mid-1970s, Record Ridgway stood as one of the dominant hand tool combines in the world. The company that two Black Country brothers had started in 1898 with Marlin spikes, and a family quarrel had become the maker of Britain's standard workshop tools. The blue vise that held the work, the grey plane that smoothed it, the chisel that cut it. The empire, briefly, was complete. But the acquisitions were running ahead of cash, and nobody standing in the Parkway Works in 1976, listening to the drop hammers and the surface grinders, watching Tony Hampton walk his daily round through the machine shop, could have known that the summit they were standing on had a name. It was called the Peak, and the view from the peak in industrial Sheffield only ever looked one way. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. Platt's Forgings was closed in 1980. The drop forging business was sold to Mabey & Johnson on 10th February 1981. These were the first amputations, small ones, at the periphery, the kind of trimming that management could present as housekeeping, but they were symptoms of something structural, and the structure was collapsing across the entire Don Valley. The Thatcher government had ended the protectionist subsidies that propped up nationalised British steel. The 1980 national steel strike was used, in J. Emery's analysis, to usher in huge cuts before privatisation in 1988. Sheffield steel employment dropped from over 50,000 in the 1970s to under 10,000 by 1990. Local unemployment rose from 4% in 1978 to 11.3% in 1981 and 16% in 1984. Manufacturing, which had employed nearly half of Sheffield's workforce in 1971, employed just 24% of a much-reduced workforce by 1984. The lower Don Valley, where Parkway sat, lost nearly 20,000 steel jobs between 1978 and 1981 alone. 3 years, 20,000 livelihoods. The firms that had fed the constant percussive rhythm of drop hammers along Bernard Street and South Street were falling silent one by one, and the silence spread like damp through brickwork. The neighbouring tool firms went with them. Joseph Rogers and Sons, holders of a royal warrant under 5 monarchs from George IV to George V, employer of 1,500 people in 1914, ceased trading in 1983. The Washington works of George Wostenholm, the IXL trademark, the great American export name of 19th century Sheffield, was demolished in 1978, and the brand went bankrupt with its parent in 1983. Ward and Payne's Limbrick Works in Hillsborough had already burned down in 1970. The site became housing. The Sheffield scissor industry, which had supported around 150 firms in the 1970s, would be down to 2 by the 2010s. The Little Mesters system that Geoffrey Tweedale had called self-reinforcing was now self-destroying. Every firm that closed took customers and suppliers from every other. Britain had joined the European Common Market in 1973. Tariffs against high-quality, lower-priced continental tools fell. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the consolidation of the British DIY market into a handful of buying chains, B&Q, Wickies, Screwfix, Toolstation, compressed supplier margins with a ruthlessness that a family-run Sheffield firm had never been built to withstand. Where Hedley Atkinson had spent decades cultivating relationships with independent hardware dealers and Commonwealth distributors, the new retail landscape was governed by procurement spreadsheets and price points per linear foot of shelf space. The relationship didn't matter. The unit cost did. Record's own facilities at Parkway aged. Capital expenditure ran below depreciation, the quiet financial signal that a company is consuming its own fabric. The buildings that had felt like a coronation in 1963 were now 30 years old, their sawtooth roofs leaking, their electrical systems dating from the original installation. The heavy machine shop still turned Acme thread screws on capstan lathes, but the lathes themselves were aging, and the investment required to replace them with CNC equipment would have run into millions that neither the company nor its succession of owners was willing to commit. On January 30th, 1981, after what the Times described carefully as a period of losses, Record Ridgeway was acquired by AB Bacco of Sweden. The 78-year independence of the Hamptons in Sheffield was over. Tony Hampton remained chairman through the transition and into a 1985 management buyout, Record Holdings plc, a return to British ownership. But the firm's gravitational identity was now post-family. It was renamed Record Marples, Woodworking Tools, Limited in 1988, with both names cast into plain bodies, a key dating marker for collectors. Then Record Tools Limited in 1991. Then Record Holdings plc again in 1993. Each name change was a tightening. Each one moved the brand a little further from the hands that had built it. The Bacco years, the management buyout years, the renaming years. They blur together in the historical record because, in truth, none of them solved the underlying problem. The underlying problem was that Sheffield hand tools, made at Sheffield wages, in Sheffield buildings, with Sheffield steel, could no longer compete on price with tools made anywhere else. There were no headline strikes. The AEU and later AEEU shop at Parkway appears to have been, by Sheffield standards, low strife, consistent with Tony Hampton's paternalistic floor-walking culture, a culture that survived his active management even after the family lost control. There was just a long structural attrition, the sound of a works slowly running down, shift by shift, order by order, until the silence between the drop hammers grew longer than the noise. Chapter 7. The Americans arrive. In 1998, Record Tools went into administration. The board accepted an offer from American Tool Companies, Inc., and the brand passed to a firm whose roots couldn't have been more different from the Hamptons. American Tool was privately held by the Peterson family of DeWitt, Nebraska, owners of Vice Grip Pliers, the firm William Peterson had founded in 1934. They had bought the original Charles Irwin Auger Bit Company of Martinsville, Ohio, in 1993. The Petersons were Midwestern American tool consolidators, acquiring names the way a property developer acquires addresses. Record became one more name in the portfolio. The exact purchase price was never publicly disclosed. Then, on April 30th, 2002, Newell Rubbermaid completed the acquisition of the remaining 50.5% of American Tool Companies, having already held a 49.5% minority stake. The headline price was around $419 million in cash plus debt assumption. Subsequent SEC filings put the fully loaded figure, including $243 million of American Tool debt and $27 million in transaction costs, at approximately $467 million. American Tool was placed within Newell Rubbermaid's leveler/hardware group and formally renamed Irwin Industrial Tool Company in 2003. The men who made these decisions are nameable. Joseph Galley Jr., a former Black & Decker executive who had built up the DeWalt brand, briefly served as president and COO of Amazon.com, then CEO of VerticalNet, had become president and CEO of Newell Rubbermaid in January 2001. He told Forbes in 2002 that he intended to grow Newell into the global market for hand tools and power tool accessories, over $10 billion. He personally championed the American Tool acquisition. James Roberts, a 19-year Black & Decker veteran and former president of Stanley Works' worldwide hand tools and hardware unit, headed Newell's leveler and hardware group from 2001. Roberts was effectively the executive directly responsible for integrating the Sheffield operation into the new Irwin global brand. Neither man had ever stood on the Parkway floor. Neither man had watched Tony Hampton walk his daily round. Closer to Sheffield, the Irwin executive profiled by the British trade press was Ian Watson, age 30, appointed marketing director for UK and Asia Pacific in May 2002. Watson had joined Record Tools as a product manager in 1999, immediately after the American Tool acquisition, and risen to UK marketing manager in 2001. The Drum Trade magazine published a full-page profile on April 9, 2003, photographing Watson at Irwin's 17-acre manufacturing site in Sheffield. His £2 million rebrand budget was discussed enthusiastically. Partnerships with the Daily Star, with Power League for nationwide football tournaments, with British construction trade bodies. The language was all forward momentum, all growth, all brand building. Watson was eloquent on the strategy. "We want Irwin to become a global power brand," he told the Drum, "but to be firmly positioned towards the end user of our tools, that is, professional tradesmen and expert DIY ears, on the brand cull from the 36 brands inherited via American Tool. There were just too many brands in our portfolio, and we had no user brand connection. People did not associate, for instance, a record tool with a jacksaw or a marbles vise. On Record itself, we did research and found that some of our brands, such as Record, Jack and Marbles, had equity with professional tradesmen. The Irwin mark on the tool ultimately means that it is professional quality, and the beauty is that Record has always been a professional brand, so this is not such a big shift for us." And then a sentence whose import would only become clear later. "I am measured on growing our business. If we win awards for our marketing creativity but do not grow the business, ultimately I get sacked. I would rather build the business by 25% than win an award." The April 2003 Drum interview presented Sheffield as a continuing 17-acre manufacturing centre, the platform for a global power brand. Within months, mass production at Parkway was being wound down. Chapter 8. The colour changes. The closure wasn't an event. It was a process, and the public record is curiously thin. There was no single press-released shutdown date, no announcement, no ceremony, no photograph of the last vise coming off the line. The local chronicler Joe Freeman's account states bluntly, "In 2003, American Tool Companies Incorporated changed its name to Irwin Industrial Tool Company, and shortly after began closing their own factories and having their products made mainly in China." Tool Collector and Urban Explorer sources almost universally cite 2003 or 2004 as the main shutdown date. The Marples family curator gives a slightly later date for chisel production, at least 2008, with blades marked "Made in Sheffield, England." A Garage Journal poster reported that all the CNC machines in the Sheffield plant were sold in a public auction. Another summarised the trade understanding with a directness the corporate communications never managed. The Record plant in Sheffield closed down years ago. Irwin bought the Record name and turned the Sheffield office into the Irwin UK sales office, and immediately started outsourcing Irwin Record tools to China. The honest reading is that vise and clamp production stopped at Parkway in 2003 or 2004. Residual chisel manufacture continued in part of the estate until around 2008, A smaller adjacent Marples site at Darnall continued operating for a few years longer, first reported abandoned by urban explorers in 2013 or 2014, with the note that it had been shut for a year or two by the looks of it. A precise final headcount hasn't survived in the public record. The Parkway workforce at the end was in the low hundreds. The gates that had seen 1,000 workers arrive for the morning shift now saw a security guard and a manned barrier. The supply chain that replaced Sheffield tells its own story. According to Rob Lee of Lee Valley, among the most authoritative voices in the modern hand tool trade, the Czech company that Lee Valley now buys from was the same company Record, and Irwin had initially contracted to produce replacement vices. The cost, apparently, wasn't low enough. So Record and Irwin tried China, where the quality wasn't high enough. They abandoned the product. The Czech company was left with vices and no customer. The tooling pattern then made its way to an Indian subcontractor. The Anant 52.5 pattern is near identical. And finally to China. Marples chisels appear to have been routed via Irwin's facility in Udine, Italy, before drifting to Asia. The journey of the tooling reads like a parable. Sheffield to the Czech Republic, to India, to China. Each move chasing a lower cost, each move losing something that couldn't be specified on a purchase order. The political response was, by the standards of British industrial closures, almost silent. A search of Hansard for the period 2003 to 2010 turned up no recovered debate, written question, or early-day motion, specifically about Record Tools, Record Ridgeway, Record Marples, Irwin Industrial Tools, or the Parkway Works closure. Not from Richard Cabourn, Sheffield Central. Not from David Blunkett, Sheffield Brightside. Not from Clive Betts, Sheffield Attercliffe, and later Sheffield South East, the constituency in which Parkway physically sat. Sheffield by 2003 was 3 decades into industrial decline. The closure of a tool factory of a few hundred people, in a city that had lost tens of thousands of steel jobs in the 1980s, was no longer politically visible. It wasn't even audible. The relevant union, Amicus, produced no published industrial action moment. The redundancies were phased. The press releases were corporate. The local coverage was minimal. The corporate template was visible in a parallel Newell decision. On 8 July 2009, Newell Rubbermaid announced consultation on closing the Parker pen plant at New Haven, East Sussex. 180 jobs lost, production moved to Nantes. The language was identical. This decision is a response to structural issues accelerated by market trends and is in no way a reflection on the highly valued work performed by our employees over the years. Irwin closed the original vice grip plant at DeWitt, Nebraska in 2008, ending 80 years of American manufacture. Same justification, same template, same silence afterwards. The pattern wasn't unique to Sheffield. It was a corporate grammar, and Record was just one more sentence in a very long paragraph. Chapter 9. The verdict in the vice. The single most documented forensic indicator of the Sheffield to China transition is the colour itself. The deep navy of Stokes's Roundel blue had been progressively replaced through the 1980s by a slightly lighter shade. The post-2003 Chinese-sourced vices use a notably different and rougher blue, used by collectors as the field mark of provenance. A typical observation from the Garage Journal. You can pick out the Irwin ones by the colour and texture of the paint. The shade is slightly different and the finish isn't as smooth. Beneath the paint, the change was deeper. The pre-Irwin Record vices used malleable iron for shock-loading models. The numbers 34, 84, 84/34 and 36, the engineer's vices, and good-grade grey cast iron for the fitters and quick-release types. The post-2003 Chinese vices abandoned the malleable iron specification on heavy-duty models. The screw thread, formerly a single-start Acme form, became a softer carbon steel approximation. Jaws stopped seating squarely. Sliding rods stopped running smoothly. The cast bases came as cast and, in the words of those who tried to use them, not remotely flat. Paul Sellers, the Welsh-born, US-trained master joiner, who became, through his blog and the Woodworking Masterclasses platform, the most influential British hand tool teacher of the digital age, has documented the collapse with remorseless specificity. On the vices, writing in October 2013. Because Record sold off its tooling and production here in the UK ceased, Irwin Record vises are no longer produced in the UK, but on another continent. The quality of castings does not match those of the original record marples, and so longevity will likely match that of Asian imports. On the plains in March 2019, after examining a student's new Irwin Record No. 4 smoother. Oh, it was such a sick, sinking feeling in my spirit. My student's Irwin Record No. 4 smoothing plane sat bright blue atop his workbench awaiting my critique. He was proud of it, but couldn't get it to cut at all. The blade had a twist so pronounced sellers compared it to a boat propeller. The handle was too small for average men's hands. The stamped-out platework for the cap, iron and blade was shoddily finished, or unfinished. It sold at Screwfix for £15. A tool whose ancestors had been made to last a century was now priced to be discarded within a year. Sellers, August 2022. Essay annotated the price collapse and the marketing reversal with the precision of an auditor. A Sheffield-made record number 52 and a half ED. The iconic woodworker's vise, the totemic British workshop fitting, had cost roughly £130 from the Hampton-era company in the early 2000s. After the production moved, sellers bought 5 of the British-made originals on eBay for £32 each. By 2022, the new Chinese-made Irwin Record 52.5 ED was selling at around £210. His verdict on the marketing. Irwin Record stretches the truth by a marketing boast as follows. Irwin, 133 years of ingenuity and high quality, when in reality they simply bought the record name a few years back. If you doubt that these vices are one and the same as the old records, you'd be right. They are record in name only. A contributor on the Lost Art Press blog left testimony that reads like a small elegy for £60 misspent. I went and bought a record vise at my local woodcraft many years ago. It was a lot of money for me at the time, but I splurged and bought it. This was a real record vise before they sold out to Irwin or whoever makes the vise now in China. Summary. What a POS. I tried to keep using it, but I finally threw that sucker in the trash. The quick release was always stiff. I tried to reduce the diameter of the guide rods, but it never worked smooth. The screw is not an Acme thread, and the metal is soft, not hardened like it should have been. The Made in Sheffield stamp itself became contested. Some post-2003 castings continued to carry Sheffield, England in raised lettering, a marketing fiction exploiting the historic name. As one Garage Journal contributor noted, while it's common in some countries to find tools marked Sheffield, England when they're actually imported, the excuse being that it's the company address, in the United Kingdom that practice is actually illegal under the Trade Descriptions Act, and there have been prosecutions. Marple's blue-chip chisels began appearing with electro-etched, made in Sheffield markings on Chinese blades that, in the bitter words of the Marple's curator, can be easily rubbed out. 100 years of accumulated trust, a name that had meant something in every workshop from Plymouth to Perth, rubbed out. Chapter 10. The Inheritance. The clearest measure of what was lost is the second-hand market. A vintage Sheffield-made record number 52.5 on a typical 2024 or 2025 UK eBay listing sells in the £100 to £250 range depending on condition. Made in Sheffield stamping commands a premium over generic, later Made in England castings. The American premium dealer Jim Bode Tools advertises specimens in the language of antique collectibles. One of the best woodworking vices ever made. This is the original £35 record made in England, not one of the current Asian knockoffs you see on eBay. Sawmill Creek estimates run from $250 to $300 for a clean specimen. The new Chinese Irwin Record 52.5 ED retails for roughly £210. The vintage tool, in real terms, holds or exceeds its original sale price. The replacement, after 20 years, has acquired neither premium nor reputation. A large vintage tool dealer ecosystem has grown around this gap. Bristol Design stocks Record alongside Norris, Spears, Matheson and Preston. Toolteak in Norwich refurbishes and resells. Workshop Heaven, Matthew Platt's site, which curates surviving Sheffield makers and sells the premium Chinese-made Guangsheng and Luban planes that have arguably stepped into Record's old-quality slot, is unsentimental in its recommendation. We usually get our vises on eBay as they are no longer made. The model is the Record 52.5E, but we would not recommend the Record Irwin alternative. Beyond the price data, the more poignant evidence is anecdotal. the blue record vise has become an inheritance object, a generational marker in British DIY culture. From the Fine Woodworking Forum, I too have one that I've inherited from my dad's worktop. Somewhere along the way, my dad thought it was a good idea to remove the stop in the vise, and I cannot figure out where to source a replacement. From Brian Dory's restoration blog, for over 40 years we have had a #1 record vise in our shed, and it has been well used and abused over the years. From a MIG welding forum, a man whose 4-inch record number 3 had been used for 40 years by him, and long before by his father. It arrived broken. He sought repair rather than replacement. Be a sin to chuck it away. Paul Sellers frames vintage records as multi-generational tools. I have a record vise that I have been using for 50 years to date, and it was old when I bought it. His teaching has built a movement around fettling and saving vintage tools rather than buying new, a quiet resistance that has, paradoxically, made the global afterlife of the Sheffield design tradition a thriving market. Guangsheng Chinese-made bedrock pattern planes, sold through Workshop Heaven, now occupy the price-quality slot that Record itself held for 70 years. The design survived. The name didn't. Or rather, the name survived but lost its meaning, which is worse. The current ownership of the Record brand completes the circle with an irony so precise it reads like fiction. Stanley Black and Decker of New Britain, Connecticut completed the $1.95 billion acquisition of Newell's tools business, Irwin, Lennox, Hilmer, and with them Record and Marples, on March 10, 2017. Stanley Black and Decker. The same corporate lineage that made the Plains record originally copied in 1931. The British company that built itself on copying expired Stanley patents, then beat Stanley on quality, was eventually bought by an American company that was in turn bought by Stanley. The circle didn't just close, it swallowed itself. Chapter 11. What the Blue Keeps. Parkway Works stands today as it has stood for 2 decades, in a state of ambiguous post-industrial limbo. The main factory has been derelict since the 2003 and 2004 closure. Parts of the wider site are sublet as a multi-tenanted business park with a manned security gate and tenants including insurance brokers and light industrial users. The buildings themselves, red brick, sawtooth-roofed, the iconic gates, the empty cast-iron switchgear of the old electrical substation, have become a destination for Sheffield's urban explorer subculture. The street artist Flem has covered interior walls with murals that are, in their own way, another kind of making in a place built for it. Sheffield photographer Vivica Coe has produced panoramic studies of what she titled, simply, Abandoned Toolmaker's Workshop in Sheffield. An explorer in 2022 wrote that ungraffitied industrial space in Sheffield is something of a rarity these days. A Sheffield Forum commenter, more plainly, another part of Sheffield's heritage just rotting away. On June 19, 2025, EQT Real Estate lodged plans for full demolition of the existing Record and Ridgeway buildings and construction of 3 new industrial warehouses, totaling around 280,000 square feet. If demolition proceeds, the Flem murals go with it, collateral damage alongside the last fabric of the works themselves. There is no blue plaque, no formal heritage memorial. The site isn't in a conservation area. The cultural commemoration of Record is held elsewhere and held informally. Kelham Island Museum on Alma Street holds the Hawley tool collection assembled by the late Sheffield tool retailer Ken Hawley, catalogues, photographs, films and edge tools, forming what the museum describes as an internationally important material record of tool-making, cutlery manufacture and silversmithing from Sheffield. The Tools and Trades History Society, founded 1983, holds the largest collection of Record and Hampton catalogues. The Hand Tool Preservation Association of Australia, founded 1982, maintains a parallel collection in Melbourne, a direct legacy of Hedley Atkinson's export programme. Sheffield tools catalogued on the other side of the world. The genuine Sheffield survivors keep something alive at small scale. Footprint, Sheffield Limited at Owlerton. Robert Sorby, around 40 employees. Henry Taylor Tools. Thomas Flynn and Company, the last UK sawmaker, which acquired Clifton Planes in 2014 and now produces the premium British plane line. William Whiteley and Sons, Ernest Wright, rescued by crowdfunding in 2018. The Made in Sheffield certification mark, Administered since 2005 by the Cutlers Company of Hallamshire, Sheffield City Council and the Chamber of Commerce, has by the mid-2020s some 200 licensees. It is, by an irony at the heart of this story, legally unavailable to the current owners of the Record brand. Their record-marked products aren't made in Sheffield. The strongest legal assertion of authenticity is precisely the one the brand can no longer make. The compressed arc, if you wanted it in 3 sentences, runs like this. 2 Black Country brothers came to Sheffield in 1898 and copied an expired patent so well that for 70 years their blue cast-iron vise and their grey iron bench plane were the standard tools of the British workshop, school and shipyard, exported across the Commonwealth and outselling the American firm whose patents they'd stolen. In 1998, after a series of sales and distress restructurings, the brand passed to an American conglomerate, which 6 years later closed the Sheffield factory, sold the tooling first to the Czech Republic and then to China, and reused the name to market vices whose paint, cast iron, screw threads and reputation were all measurably worse than the originals their grandfather's generation had owned. Today, the genuine pre-1998 Sheffield tools sell on eBay at premiums above the new replacements. The Parkway Works stands derelict awaiting demolition for warehousing. No Sheffield MP intervened, no union strike defended the works, and the inheritance of the British shed is entering its final generational handover. What remains, for the people who actually use the tools, is the colour. BS 381 C110. Roundel blue. If you hold a vintage Sheffield cast record number 52.5 ED in your hands today, perhaps inherited, perhaps bought for £100 on eBay, the blue is slightly darker than what now passes under the same name. The iron is denser. The screw turns smoother. The front jaw closes square. The casting is true. It'll work for another 70 years. It is, in many British sheds, the last working object that connects a grandson to a grandfather, to a great-grandfather, all of whom learned to use it from the same catalogue number 17 and the same edition of Planecraft. A brand whose name had been a guarantee of quality became, through a series of perfectly rational corporate decisions, a guarantee of nothing. The Parkway Works will be demolished. The blue will not.